Yeah, that's probably. Well, and that's different. They just say, well, you're done.
Yeah.
I guess what I've been telling people is, you know,
Well,
acknowledge the fact that the state is trying to move hard to do something that no other state has figured out how to do. And that it's not perfect and it's not easy to do, but they're trying. That's kind of the message that I. Who else has figured out conductive administration? And Idaho is like committed and trying to do it. But yeah, it makes.
You'll see a run at that this year. You'll see a run at that this year.
Well, I'm sure.
I think some people
Yeah.
will take a run at that.
Yeah, I'm sure. Doesn't change the physics. So, okay, let's get started. It's 3 o'clock. Another Wednesday has come upon us. So yeah, thank you all for being here. So this must be week 5. I don't know. Are we 5 weeks into the seminar series? Hey, Dan, neighbor, howdy. Thanks for coming. Yeah, so this is the 5th installment in the special 40th anniversary of the Henry Swartz Foundation Seminar Series. The seminar series isn't in its 40th year, but the Henry Swartz Foundation is. And so we're having our, I don't know, this is the 7th year, 6th or 7th of the seminar series.
I think it's the
8th, I don't know. Well, there you go. So, but we're doing the series a little differently in commemoration of the 40th anniversary. And each week is devoted to a different topic and a subject matter area in which HFF is actively engaged. And so today's topic is water management and administration. And so that's obviously a subject area in which HFF works. This will be complemented by the climate topic on July, it'll be the second to the last one, so whatever the last Wednesday in July, and we will be talking about water supply, kind of from a higher level of trends that we've seen, and so that one's related in terms of water supply. But this is about how we take the supply we have and administer it. So today's panel, I'll go from, I guess, start at this end. James Cefalo works for Idaho Department of Water Resources. What's your title at the regional manager? Yeah, the Idaho Falls regional office, Upper Snake River, and he handles water rights cases, contested cases. I sit in a lot of meetings that James facilitates related to new water rights and protests of those and settling those protests. And then we have in the center here Craig Chandler, who is the Watermaster of Water District 1, sort of newly in that position, although he's worked for Water District 1 for 10 years, about. And so he knows a lot about Water District 1, and he is now actually in charge of it. And I'll let him talk more about Water District 1 and what he does, because it's really relevant to the topic. And then Roger Warner, owner of Rocky Mountain Environmental. It's a consulting firm that we've worked with, and I've worked with you all for a very long time, going back to the founding days of Rocky Mountain Environmental, which is
1991.
I was gonna say 30 plus years ago.
34.
So,
3. Sorry.
whatever that is. Yeah, I can't either, obviously, this afternoon. So anyway, we have lots to cover. I've had lots of questions over the last several weeks about groundwater surface water settlement. We'll get there. But I'd like to start with James. Well, no, let's even start with a map, because I promised these fellows that we'd have a map here to orient everyone, and they're on those other monitors. So this is the Upper Snake River Basin. Actually, it's more than that, because it goes all the way down into the Hell's Canyon. But just to orient everyone, the orange polygon.
Well, you've got state boundary here.
Yes.
And that's Bear Lake
Perfect.
right here. So
Yeah.
I mean that's really the southeast corner of the state.
Yeah.
that you captured.
So the orange or yellow, whatever that's the Henry's Fork watershed, just to put in perspective that we take up a pretty good chunk of this, but by no means all of it. And so there's a few key locations kind of headed down the river. So let's see if we can pull those up. Okay, so Heisey, there's a stream gauge at Heisey that's one of the centennial gauges. It's been there since 1910. So, and it measures flow in the South Fork, or the main Snake River, downstream of Palisades. When adjusted for storage and delivery in Palisades and Jackson, it essentially gives us a measure of natural stream flow, water supply into the basin from the Snake River, and that's about 50% of the total supply right there, and we have a very long record. So that's a real key point in administering the basin. Yeah. Moving on down, Milner Dam, it's down near Burley. It's the lowest point of surface water diversion in Water District 1. And Craig will say something about the importance of Milner Dam. Very, very important point on the river system. And then King Hill, there's another stream gauge that's been there since 1910. It's sort of the pair that goes with Heisey. It's essentially measures all the outflow from the upper Snake Basin, including the discharge from the eastern Snake Plain Aquifer. All of that water is back in the surface system at that point, so that's a key point in actually figuring out how much water we have. And then the last point I have on here, by no means the last point of importance, but for this discussion, Swan Falls Dam, which is just due south of Boise, it's right due south of downtown Boise, and there is a minimum stream flow that the state is obligated to meet at that point, related to a settlement with Idaho Power that dates back to 1984. So that's another key point, that even though we're talking about water administration in the upper basin, that still plays into this. And then there's other stuff downstream, like salmon flow augmentation, other stuff that is important, but I don't have marked on that. So I'll start with James to just give us start with an overview of what a water right is, how our water right system works, how a person gets a water right, and what those things entail.
So that's exactly what I've got here. Water Rights 101. So in Idaho, the state owns the water, and that can be kind of a misconception even with farmers. You'll run into farmers that believe they own the water. They don't own the water. The state owns the water, but we issue water rights. So a water right is the right to use and put that water to use for some beneficial use. So if you don't have a beneficial use, then you can't divert the water. So you can imagine a farmer who may grow hay. If they're cutting their field and they can't irrigate, their water right just kind of that stays in the creek, right? They don't get to lay claim on that water and to say, well, I'm going to give that water to someone else. If they don't have a beneficial use for that water right, then it just remains in the stream and goes to another water right. So water rights are made up of elements, and you're probably familiar with some of the elements. We have priority date, so that's when the water right was first established. We've got source, we've got a point of diversion, which is where somebody can take it either out of the ground, a groundwater well, or out of a creek. We've got a season of use, a diversion rate expressed in cubic feet per second, but oftentimes farmers especially like to talk in gallons per minute or inches. All of those represent just how fast you can take water out of the stream. We have an annual diversion volume. We talk about that in acre feet. Sometimes people want to talk about it in millions of gallons. What can you take over the course of an entire year or over the course of an entire irrigation season? Another element of a water right is place of use. Where can you use the water? For irrigation rights, our irrigation rights are defined specifically. So if you have a 10-acre water right, we have mapped out at the Department of Water Resources what 10 acres you can put that water right on, or what 10 acres you can irrigate. And then there may be some other conditions that may just dictate how one water right interacts or interfaces with other water rights from the same stream. We sometimes have conditions that say, in times of scarcity, this water right is the most junior right on the creek. And so it just helps a Watermaster know, how am I going to deliver this water in relation to other water rights. So if you want a new water right in the state of Idaho, at this point, you would file an application for permit. And that permit is your authority to develop that water right. At this stage, most of the state is closed. Well, maybe I shouldn't say most. Most of eastern Idaho is closed for new appropriations. In fact, in 2022, the director of the department issued a moratorium for the entire upper Snake River Basin. So we, at this stage, our office can't process any new water rights for consumptive use. If somebody proposes an application or proposes a new water use that would consume water, those applications have to come with a mitigation plan where that applicant is setting aside or retiring consumptive use somewhere else in the basin to offset their new use. So we deal with applications for permit, and I should note, our regional office covers all the way from Salmon to Bear Lake, and so we do more than just the Henry's Fork and the Snake River. We're covering Bear River Basin, and we're also covering some of the Salmon River Basin. And the Salmon River Basin is still open for appropriation. So if you're in the city of Salmon and you say, I want to throw a pump out in the river, water my lawn, that's something that we could still issue a water right for. But again, in the upper Snake, those types of water rights are not available. The other thing that we do in our office is we process what are called applications for transfer. And that word transfer is kind of a tricky word in Idaho. Most people are thinking that means I'm conveying my water right. No, the word transfer means that you're changing an element of your water right. So if you want to change your point of diversion from this ditch, go down creek a mile and pump out of the creek, that would be a change in point of diversion. You would file a transfer application in that scenario. So it's changing any element of a water right. You file an application for transfer. And we process a lot of those. Some of them really big, some of them really small. It may be, a farmer just wants to add another well to their system to improve efficiency. We would process that out of our office. Those applications, both applications for permit and applications for transfer, go through a public notice phase. So in our office, we're still living in the Stone Age. We're putting stuff in newspapers. I don't know who reads newspapers, but we put that application or notice in the newspaper, but we also post it on our website. And there's a certain time period where anyone who feels like they may be negatively impacted can jump in and file a protest. And we've seen Henry's Fork Foundation as a protest, and occasionally we've seen Fish and Game as a protest, and occasionally sometimes Surface Water Coalition, groundwater users, depending on what their concerns are, what their issues are, they may jump in as protestants to various applications. Once an application is protested, at least in our region, I act as kind of a mediator of sorts initially. We hold a settlement conference, see if we can get the parties on the same page and resolve it. If we can't, that's okay. We then schedule it for hearing. It would go through an official administrative hearing, and then the decision of the department can be appealed on up through the court system. So as I thought about just really broad level stuff with water rights and what I wanted to share with this group two things. Number one, water law is very fact specific. Changing one fact could change the answer to a question. And all the time in our office, we get a lot of calls, people just calling and saying, hey, I'm thinking about doing this thing. Is that something that can be approved? Well, and they may provide us with fact A and B, and we provide them an answer. And then they call back a week later and say, well, I spoke with somebody in your office, and they told me something different, and all of a sudden they provide you with fact A, B, but now they provide you fact C and D, which completely changes what the answer is. And I know that Roger deals with this quite a bit. Because we've had some contested cases where he represents an applicant, and all of a sudden we're in the middle of a contested case proceeding, whether it's an informal settlement conference, and the applicant says something that Roger wasn't even aware of, and all of a sudden the whole thing blows up because, well, if we would have known that, you couldn't have filed the application, right? And we end up where the application just gets withdrawn. So every fact matters in these water right proceedings, and there's just a lot of nuance in Idaho water law. The other thing that I wanted to share is, even though Idaho has been a state for 130 years, there's still a lot of unanswered questions in Idaho water law. You'd be surprised that big major columns that is holding up the building of Idaho water law, people ask a question, I'll say, I don't know. Court's never answered that, and we, the department may have a position on what we think the answer is, but it's still an unanswered question. I'm thinking just in the last 2 years, in 2022, there was a decision from the Idaho Supreme Court on enlargement. Enlargement has been there's been a prohibition on enlarging or expanding your water rights, I think from statehood, but all of a sudden, 130 years later, the Supreme Court finally answered one of those major questions about enlargement. And even right now, there's a case that is at the district court answering a question about forfeiture and whether the department has the authority to declare a water right forfeited for non-use. Again, forfeiture's been on the books for 130 years, that concept, but that question has never been answered. So there's still a lot of things out there that are kind of ambiguous.
Welcome to my world.
Yeah, and this is where consultants and attorneys make their money. There's still a lot of room, I guess, to disagree and fight about interpreting the law. Most basins, and this is the other thing that I wanted to share, most basins in the Snake River drainage are fully appropriated. And some people would maybe even argue over appropriated. For surface water, I don't know that you can be over appropriated. I mean, what happens is, you reach a point where the demand exceeds the supply, and then Watermasters have to step in, and Craig's going to talk a little bit more about this, and deliver water to the seniors and possibly curtail the junior rights. Between 1987 and 2014, the state undertook an adjudication of water rights. That's kind of a cataloging of water rights in the Snake River Basin, and that was meant to catalog and confirm every water right that exists. But I kind of see that adjudication, kind of late 80s, early 90s, is a major pivot for the state, especially in the Snake River Basin, where we went from being a state of appropriation and handing out water rights and people appropriating new water rights. We don't do that much anymore, right? Most of the basins are closed, and now we're a state where we're primarily focused on administration and dividing up and deciding who gets water in times of shortage. So that was kind of my quick overview.
That's perfect. Yeah, thanks for covering the adjudication. That's a question I always get. What does even that mean? And yeah, you summarize that very well. So yeah, Craig, why don't you give us an idea what Water District 1 is for starters, who the Watermaster is in that entity, and then how you, as James just said, how you go about deciding who gets water and who doesn't. Now, I'll say one thing, we're talking about surface water. Craig doesn't administer groundwater. Right. We'll get to the groundwater second. So this is about surface water first, then we'll complicate it. Things went well, I think, as long as we were just administering surface water. But Craig, you can talk about how that works in Water District 1.
Yeah, so hi, I'm the Watermaster for Water District 1, Craig Chandler. That it is a question with people unfamiliar with, water districts. It is, what is Water District 1? What do you do? And it's the answer to that question in some ways is simple, and in other ways is very complicated. So Water District 1 has been around for a long time. It's one of the oldest water districts in Idaho. It may be the oldest. And it's been in operation for over 100 years. We produce products such as water right accounting, which accounts for water rights and diversion use, and storage report, which tracks storage use and where it goes, transactions. And we provide services as part of producing those products, such as flow rate measurements, and we also facilitate what is called the rental pool, where storage is sold and leased and rented. And so to start off with the history, I wanted to talk a little bit about just the history of very basic level, the difference between riparian water right and prior appropriation. So riparian water rights are, more in the east, and what those are is they're tied to the land. So if you own some land and the river's next to you, you have a right to use some of that. Here in Idaho, we are prior appropriation, which means first in time, first in right is what you'll often hear. And what that means is if you have somebody that's come in and settled a piece of land and started using some water and putting it to use, and they've got a water right for that, they have the right to that water, even if somebody comes in upstream from them and starts diverting that water and using it. The senior is the first one that gets entitlement to that water. And it's not only until that senior's water right is completely satisfied. If there's any left over, then a junior water right, can have entitlement to it. That's a really important concept when we talk, in the context of what's going on right now with the Surface Water Coalition and the groundwater users. From a very simple level, it comes down to we are a prior appropriation state, and the senior water rights are the first ones that get the water. So farmers first started diverting out of the Snake River in the 1870s. There were 25 canals built from Heisey to Rigby in the 1880s. And then we reached a point where the Snake River at Blackfoot started drying up every year for a 10-mile stretch in 1905. And the reason it was drying up is because of the diversions upstream from Blackfoot were using all the water, and there was no regulation. And so, that sparked a lot of outcry from diversions below Blackfoot and diversions in Blackfoot. And that really kind of kick-started a number of sequences. So the first one would be an adjudication in 1910 called the Rexburg Decree and the Foster Decree. Both those, attempted to define some of these water rights that were being used early on. And then Water District 1 was established in 1919. And the purpose of Water District 1 was to regulate diversions and water rights by their priority and by flow rates. And also to ensure that Jackson Lake storage that was released out of Jackson Lake could reach its contract holders below Blackfoot. So in other words, people couldn't just divert it because it's flowing past their head. So Rob mentioned Milner Dam. It was the first reservoir constructed on the system. It's a really important point in Idaho. The state of Idaho has a policy of zero flow at Milner. That means that all the water that originates upstream from that can be used by water rights upstream from Milner, and there's no requirement for water to be delivered to a water right downstream from Milner. So construction of reservoirs started: Milner Dam, Jackson Lake, Lake Walcott, Henry's Lake, American Falls. That was kind of the first big tranche of reservoirs that came in. And then we hit a period of serious drought in the 1930s, and it was a pretty bad drought. And it got so bad that at one point the National Guard had to be called out to help regulate some of the diversions in the Upper Teton. Part of that sparked the construction of several new reservoirs to help, alleviate some of the water shortage problems. And so then you had Island Park Reservoir built, Grassy Lake, Palisades Reservoir, and Ryrie Reservoir. And so those are all the major reservoirs within Water District 1 that we account for and track and regulate. In 1978, that was the first year that the accounting methodology used by Water District 1 became digital, and we started to account for water rights on a daily basis. That was kind of a new step. And so I guess transitioning from, that's kind of a history of how Water District 1 came to be, now kind of moving forward to what it is, what do we do currently. So like I mentioned, our two kind of cornerstone products that we produce are the Water Right Accounting Program and the Storage Report. We've got approximately 15 staff, 5 office staff and 10 summer hydrographers that help us. They help us collect data, do measurements, do regulation, process that data, run some of our programs. And the really fundamental thing that we do to start with is we need to quantify how much natural flow is available in the system. And so once you have that quantity of natural flow, you then take that natural flow and you deliver it to the earliest priority water rights first. And you keep delivering it to the earliest priority water rights until you're out. out of natural flow, and then at that point, then it moves to, diversions either need storage, or you look at things like curtailment. And so, we use reach gain analysis to quantify how much natural flow there is available. It's basically, we look at the outflow of a gauge and the inflow of a gauge, and we can tell how much water is, either entering that reach or leaving that reach. And then, our other program, so that's kind of the water right accounting program, is reach gain analysis, quantification of natural flow, and distribution of that natural flow. And then our other big program is a storage report program, which, once the reservoirs fill, like they did this year, which is always good, we then allocate that storage to the different space holders. Some years are different, like some years we don't have full reservoirs, and in that case, if a canal, carried water over from a previous year, it may help them out quite a bit, as opposed to a canal that used all their storage water, and now their allocation may be less in the second year. And so our storage report program helps us track that. We also facilitate the rental pool, which space holders will buy and sell. Like they'll sell some water. So like let's say a canal company always has some excess water, so they're going to sell some to groundwater users for mitigation. Or a different canal company that needs some extra water. So we track all that. On average, Water District 1 accounts for 4 million acre feet of storage water distribution and 8 million acre feet of natural flow distributed to water rights. And then, some of the other things that we do as part of our process is we do a lot of measurements. So, we hire the USGS to measure and track most of our river flow stations. They do most of that. All the canals we do ourselves. So, we install the equipment. We have fancy acoustic Doppler boats. We've got flow trackers, and we've got staff dedicating to making flow rate measurements to make sure that we know how much is being diverted where. That's pretty much an overview of what Water District 1 is and what we do.
Before I move on to Roger to introduce the groundwater component, Craig, how is Water District 1 funded? How do you support the 15 staff and the flow measurements and the equipment and all that stuff?
So it's rather unique. So Water District 1 is entirely funded by our water users. So none of our funding comes from appropriations or taxes. It's all assessed to our water users who are actually using the water, and we assess them for what we expect the upcoming year's expenses to be.
And it's proportional, so if there's a canal company that diverts 5% of all of the water diverted, it pays 5% of the total cost.
Yeah, and if you ever go on a USGS site, I'm glad you mentioned that you essentially pay USGS to measure flow at most locations in your system. If you go to a USGS site and you see this gauge is partially funded or funded by Water District 1, that means that it was funded by the water users, and USGS would not operate that gauge otherwise for a scientific purpose or something. And we actually have seen over the years, we just had another one lost from USGS, a gauge that is not funded by the water users that was put there for scientific purposes or something else. A lot of those gauges have disappeared because of lack of funding. But the ones that are critical for Craig, the nodes really in this reach gain analysis, those are the key ones, and those are the ones the water users fund. So it's just something when you're out there looking at USGS data and gauges, you'll see that, and that's what that means.
Can I ask a quick question, Ron?
Sure.
The water rights that you discussed earlier give an individual or corporation entitlement to a certain amount of water, but they have to pay for that water. They pay so much an acre foot for that water, right?
The assessment.
In a couple ways. Yep, if they're in a water district like Water District 1, they'll pay for a Watermaster every year. And if they own storage space in, say, a federal reservoir, they're also paying the Bureau of Reclamation for operation and maintenance to hold that storage water. So there are a couple places where they may have to pay.
And they may have to pay their shares in their local canal company to maintain the canal or something like that, but they're not paying a fee.
To the state.
Right, yeah.
Not to the state, to the canal company or to the distribution is.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right, thanks.
So as complicated as all this is, let's make it more complicated. So Craig mentioned he calculates natural flow every day. That's really the cornerstone of the water rights accounting program. And that is more or less the water that would be in the river in absence of the upstream diversions and storage reservoirs. So it's an estimate of what would come into the river without all that other stuff in there. So, and then he's just gonna allocate that in priority. You got 5 million, let's say we had, 15,000 CFS of natural flow. That might be a typical number later on here. And you just go down the priority list till you've accounted for 15,000 CFS, and that's the end of that. So Roger represents a lot of groundwater users. And so talk a little bit about just the importance of the Eastern Snake Plain Aquifer, how it interacts with the river, and how that makes Craig's story a lot more complicated.
Well, they say in Idaho that whiskey's for drinking and water's for fighting. And that's I don't drink whiskey, but it's probably true. Last year at this time, we had a similar situation where water early on in the spring was looking tight. And by July, we had some good storms and everything, and it zeroed out. And my people in my organization and others that I wear hats for, we spent a fair amount of time, talking to people and trying to advocate for different groundwater folks that we spent a lot of money really on that. And I remember in December when we were looking at our budget for this year and saying, the snows are good, we're gonna have full reservoirs, shouldn't be any fighting this year, this should be a good year, we'll save a lot of money. It's not working out very well this year. So, yeah, so you're right. I mean, I'm glad that Rob characterized it like that, because my company does a fair amount of consultation work in water rights, and for the most part it is groundwater rights that we work in. We don't do too much, Water District 1 takes a good care of that, and they have the Committee of 9 and other folks that just do a really good job of administrating that. And so the part that I get involved to this extent right now is this big macro scale issue on the water call, and it's complicated. It's really complicated, and the public for consumption, they only get a very high elevation taste of what that is, and it's water rights are complicated enough, but on this particular issue, there's a lot of moving parts to it. I'll try to give you the simplest form I can tell it, and I'll stand for any questions, and I'll try to stay away from any conspiracy theories.
Oh, thank you, I appreciate that.
Because I'm not a conspiracy theory type, but the elements of this is displayed quite well here. And when you talk about groundwater and conjunctive administration, I mean, water, particularly groundwater, is like it's like a money economy. When you spend $1 here in town in Ashton, that grocer or whoever that took that money in, he takes that and he spends it either on Fall River Electric or Dave's Jubilee on their wonderful ice cream or somewhere, but that money keeps moving around the system, and they say, in economics, it goes around 7 times before it leaves the area. The same is quite similar in groundwater in the system. I mean, the early pioneers diverted out water from the Snake River out on their fields. I mean, the earliest systems was all flood irrigation, and you know, less than half of that was actually consumed by the plant, and the rest was there for conveyance, and then it either returned back into canals and came back to the river, or it seeped into the ground and became groundwater. And as a result of that, over, you know, since what, 1870s, okay, on, the Snake Plain Aquifer became very full with groundwater. I mean, there was a huge mound of that artificial recharge, if you want to call it, incidental recharge. That's probably a better term that we use for it. That elevated the groundwater levels. Consequence to that, what happens when you fill things up? It's got to come out somewhere. And so, you know, you had spring flows that occur here on the upper end of American Falls Reservoir. There's a butte there called Ferry Butte, and between Ferry Butte and the American Falls Reservoir is the Fort Hall Bottoms. It's a sacred area of the tribes. The tribe owns it. If you know, it's a really cool place, but if you drive there, which I did when I was a graduate student studying it, they would have a tribal police officer right away to see why you were there, and they'd say, you gotta go. So my experience then thereafter was flying over it to observe it, because they couldn't stop me then. But there's lots of springs there. In fact, there's so many springs there that it's about 1.8 million acre feet from the springs would fill. I mean, that's almost the entire capacity of American Falls Reservoir. So as far as filling the reservoir every year, before Craig's time, it just happened. You know, he didn't have to do much in terms of administration. It just filled. I mean, flows were good. I mean, it didn't matter if the river was up or down or sideways. It just filled. Most of those springs, though, come from this upper area of the Snake Plain. You know, that the river gives and takes water as it goes down, and I was telling you about how the economy of water is it's a give and take. There are different segments that are reach gains and reach losses. And in this particular place, it's a significant reach gain that is very significant in the water column. The other area that's very significant for other parts of the Snake Plain is down in King Hill. And other spring flows flow out into the Hagerman Thousand Springs area and flow past King Hill, and King Hill is the terminus. Okay, that's the exit where they count all the tickets to make sure nobody's cheating. Okay, but that's a different area. I'm going to just mention that a lot of graphs that you see relevant to this issue, they display a really cool up-down graph, and I thought I had something similar to it. This is the Milner to King Hill graph. This is kind of the typical up-down graph that you see a lot about. This shows this bottom half showing really that there's a lot of the aquifer below there. It's not just, everybody shows this part, okay? But this graphic really is just showing water that's flowing down in the Thousand Springs area. Is that right? You're giving me the stink eye.
I see you with that.
All right. Well, we don't have to use it. That would be scary with my grandson, I know. But so I think it's sometimes this issue's mischaracterized, okay? Because a lot of folks will display this graph and say, this is our problem, and they'll show you this graph. But the problem in here is a little bit different. Not to say that it's not bad, because it is. It is in a dire situation. But so back in about during the adjudication in about year 2000, we had a very significant drought period, 2001 through about 2003, I think. It was bad, it's pretty bad, as bad as it was, I think, in the 30s. And that 1.8 million acre feet that was flowing in and day out dropped. And it dropped by about 500 CFS in that period. And it has not come back. And so it's significant because the springs that come back in here feed the river system that flows to Milner. Now, why is Milner important? It's because that's where the river gets divided into a two-river system. And all of the large canals, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not the surface water guy, they all divert out at Milner.
The majority do.
Majority.
Two of them divert out of Walcott, Lake Walcott.
Which is below or above? Okay.
But
it's yeah. So they that's in the statewide water plan, I believe. It's just the way the river's managed for zero flow at Milner. And so whatever spring flows are coming into the dam or in there affects the flows that those canals are going to get. Okay, that's part of their supply. And so among those there's 7 large canal companies. They're very large canal companies. You would go look at them and say, that's a river, that's not a canal. I mean, because they flow big flows. And this drop in flows has impacted them. And they're trying to convey their flows to their patrons in the manner that they've done in the past. Now, there have been changes along the way, but they're trying to deliver it, the same that they have been. But therein is you start to get into the weeds, okay? And it's when we get in the weeds, I say, well, do you really have enough water? And that's where we're starting to get in the weeds, where it's like, well, do you have enough for your purpose? What are your purposes? And there are multiple users and purposes, just like here in the Henry's Fork area. I mean, where you've had to meet together and solve solutions where everybody can subsist on the same water. The canal companies, back in the 70s, there was a major water fight that ensued, largely between Idaho Power and all of the surface waters. Everybody from Twin Falls all the way up to Henry's Lake, all those water users were impacted. And it was a major fight. And in the time after that, that was the Swan Falls settlement, where they agreed to minimum flows at Swan Falls such that they would, and then, Jerry Rigby's dad, Ray, was big on it. He employed some very unique strategy called trust water, which he kind of shoehorned from using trust legal terminology. He was also doing adoptions and said, hey, we can do this in trust. And so it would allow the continued development of groundwater in the plain under the guise that this is trust water now. And the trust water was, had interesting language that gave it the ability, again, I should put that in quotes, the ability of the state to review those water rights. After, I think, 20 years, they were supposed to review them and make sure that there was a sufficient supply and that there were, wasn't over appropriated. There was a lot of sideboards that were put on these water rights such that the state could continue to develop and subsist. Okay. Now, today, the issue today is then about this. It's about the return flows. Even on a great water year like this year, the courts have a methodology order that's a mandated order. It's been argued several times. The Supreme Court has affirmed these processes where they say, look, these guys are short of water, you got to come up with extra water. And the groundwater guys, I got this from the groundwater guy specifically, and he said, yeah, they're short of water. We know they're short of water. And we're trying to come up with water. But the groundwater guy's argument is curtailment of all of these acres is not the answer in the ultimate game. They would argue, and I'm not carrying their torch for you, by the way, they're not paying me, but they, I think as an economy as a whole in the state, eastern Idaho at least, we should be very concerned about it, because this year, you know, these last 2 years specifically, the methodology has changed, and where the methodology had a 20-year history of prior to that time, where groundwater users could always or almost always come up with the mitigation requirements for it. All of a sudden the methodology changed and the new methodology really, the why it's such a big deal, and I'll tell you, because everybody will ask, well, why is it a big deal this year? And the governor and lieutenant governor says, well, you should just sign up for the plan, you've done it before. And the big change is relevant to that 500 CFS that's missing. You know, the state would like, and not only the state, but the Surface Water Coalition people would like to see those flows back. And they have a goal, and and in order to get that goal, they're saying, well, look, not only do we have this 20-year history of curtailment or methodology order, but we want to impose an additional tax, if you will. And it's about, I think it's 12,000 acre foot. It was a 12,000 acre foot increase, and each subsequent year an additional 12,000 acre foot increase until the goal was met. And that's when the groundwater just said, uncle, we can't do it. You know, if we either died it this year or we die next year, but we're gonna die. You know, which in my terms to you, when I say die, I mean they're gonna go out of business. They're just gonna have to close their shop and quit irrigating and say we're over, it's done. It's bankruptcy. And so the prospect this year of that was in the neighborhood of 200, well, it was higher than that. Somebody, I don't know what the numbers, it was big. It was hundreds of thousands of acres that would have to be dried up to meet that goal. And so that's why it's got everybody's attention.
So let me ask the naive question, right? So this is kind of set up, but that's what it's for, right? So Craig describes a system where he can calculate how much natural flows in the river today, 15,000 CFS, whatever it is, and he can go through his list of surface water users. The first one gets 50 CFS, and the next one gets 100, and he goes down until he's got 15,000 CFS accounted for, and everybody else is either cut or needs to use their storage in Jackson or in Palisades or whatever. So why can't you just figure out how much water's out there and put the groundwater users in that same priority list? It's prior appropriation. And when you get to how much water there is, you cut off everybody junior that. Why can't you just do that and say, well, if it's 1954, it's 1954. Why can't we just do that with the groundwater users? And just, it's the same way the surface water users. And I'll let all three of you take a crack at that. You want to start on this end from the administrative and law standpoint, and then from yours, yeah.
From a water supply perspective, the Snake River proper has been fully appropriated for a long time. Right now, you're curtailing to
1900.
the 1900 priority date. So if you had
On the surface system.
on the surface water system, so if you had a water right that was a 1901 water right, you'd be off today. We're already down to 1900, and that's the way it's been forever, right? I mean, since 1900. I mean, those early canal companies were developed in the 1880s, 1890s, and they gobble up most of those Snake River water rights. But you guys know, groundwater wells, they weren't drilling groundwater wells for irrigation use back in 1900. Those didn't really come into being really until the 1930s and 40s, and even then there aren't many 1930s and 40s groundwater irrigation rights.
It's very shallow water.
Yeah, the bulk of the groundwater development occurred in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, and so they're far junior. And if we just did this flat curtailment, all the groundwater rights would be off anyway, right? I mean, and I thought it's probably important to touch on this to give you a sense of scale. There are 1 million acres irrigated with groundwater irrigation rights. So 1 million acres on the Snake Plain, on both sides of the river, that are irrigated from groundwater wells. and they divert about 2 million acre feet per year to irrigate those 1 million acres. You said the kind of the average diversion from the river is closer to 12 million, right?
Well, yeah, it's about, well, the diversion is probably around 8
Okay,
million.
the annual diversion
Yeah.
is about 8 million acre feet. So,
And irrigates how many acres? 4 million or 2 million?
no, 1 million of surface water, I thought too.
I thought it was, yeah, I thought it was
Okay.
roughly 50-50
Okay.
surface
Yes.
ground.
So
And there's some that's irrigated by both, that,
Yeah.
there's another 500,000 or something like
But
that.
of course, canal companies have to deal with loss, right? Because if you're gonna run water from point A to point B through an open canal, you're losing water all throughout that conveyance. And so it's not surprising that the surface water users would use much more water, so.
So if you drew the line, essentially none of those groundwater rights would ever be in priority after June whatever. I mean, here we are, July 3rd, you're at 1901 or 1900, you said?
Yep.
And all these the most senior groundwater rights are 1930s, and there's not many of those, so.
Very few.
So essentially, if you had a groundwater right, and we did it the way Craig does it, the groundwater right, people would never have any water except for a few, April and May, maybe, or maybe not even then. So, what's your,
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a pretty good summary of it. I think you pretty much hit all the points. And so like this year, for instance, which was a really good water year so far, we were able to fill all of our, all the water rights. So we would have been able to fill all the groundwater water rights all the way through July or June 20th. So this would have been a year that all the way up until June 20th, the groundwater users would have been in priority, because that's the priority we were delivering for surface water. But then, you get to June 23rd, and then now all of them are off. And so, the scale of that, of what just happened with the recent curtailment, you're talking about twice as much curtailment if you were to do it strictly according to the surface water priority.
so why doesn't
Well,
Yeah.
so
Go ahead.
the complexity, and I had showed you this earlier, and Alan Jackson had prepared this one from the Bingham Groundwater District, and he meant to show it, and the aquifer, nobody really knows how much storage is in the aquifer and how much exists, but the point being is that we subsist on the top portion of that aquifer, and the Thousand Springs and the American Falls or Fort Hall Bottoms is leaking off the top of that. And so if we go to the bank, so to speak, I mean, there's a big aquifer, a lot of gallons there. If we go to the bank and drop that aquifer, or, down lower, it doesn't spill out, and it has a negative effect for these other folks that subsist on it. That's the real deal.
Yeah, and thanks for making that point. It's something that I've told people, many of you in this room, that there's more water, you could pump more groundwater, but the pressure head in the aquifer that pushes the water back out to those surface users who have a right to it, if you draw that head down, there's still a lot of water that could be pumped, but you lose all the pressure that pushes it back out into the river system. And so I really appreciate you.
That's big.
One of the questions that we've gotten, especially over the last 20 years, is this fight between surface water users and groundwater users have been ongoing. People would turn to the state, specifically the department, and say, how dare you? Why were you issuing all these groundwater rights? Like, what were you thinking? Why do we have all these groundwater rights? And really the department is kind of in a tough situation, right? Because the way that the state constitution is written, the way that the state statute is written, is maximum development of the water resource. In fact, the Constitution says if nobody's going to be injured, then you issue a water right. I mean, that's really the idea, is if there's water still available, the department is under a constitutional obligation to keep issuing water rights. But on the other side, we've got this prior appropriation doctrine that Craig is talking about, which is first in time, first in right. Back in the 1960s and 70s, when we were issuing most of those groundwater rights, technology was such we didn't understand as well as we do today this interaction between the aquifer and the river, and how much groundwater pumping really would affect the river. We know more today than we did at the time the groundwater rights were issued. So,
So I have a view of this, I just like to see it here, this is what I say, and I may be totally wrong, and this is the interface between the legal system and the physics and prior appropriation, and, now I'm losing my train of thought about, oh, right, so you're a surface user, you have a senior right, you issue a call, and somebody mentioned a call, why don't you just, what does that mean, a water call?
It really is just if you feel like your water right isn't being satisfied. If I have a water right for 10 cubic feet per second and I'm looking at my head gate and there's only 8 there, even 8 in the creek, then I go to the Watermaster and say, I'd like to make a call for my water, meaning go up and shut off some juniors somewhere up in the creek so that I get my 10 CFS.
Right, so the surface water users are in this situation, everybody agrees, I think Roger said that really well, there's no question, the reach gains have gone down, that's their water, they have a water right to it, so they issue a call. Christina has done some research, and you also said it well, Roger, that over the first 80 years of development of irrigation, we had more water going into the aquifer than coming out through incidental seepage from canals and flood irrigation. But the Surface Water Coalition can't issue a water call against other surface users for being more efficient and putting less water in the ground. So the only legal remedy is to issue a call against another water user, so they issue it against the groundwater users, because that's the only legal avenue they have. That's my view. I don't know what you all think about it. I'll throw it out there and you can disagree.
I think on a high elevation, I agree with you, but as you drill down on that and you look at where water is coming out, I think there's more to the story about that. Because all of the canals, look, everybody's been dealing with less water, and as a result, even people in your area have found it necessary to either line their canal or put it in a pipeline in order so they can have sufficient amount for their patrons. And it's true all across. I mean, everybody's we're dealing with, we don't like to say climate change, but the fact of the matter, and I'm going to use his words, I listened to Lieutenant Governor Bedke before he was Lieutenant Governor, and he said it. He says, look, all of us, the politicians, and here I'm going to quote him, I hope it's good. I think he'd agree with it. But he says, they get asked all the time about climate change, and politically that's a hot button issue for the Republicans in the legislature. But Lieutenant Governor Bedke said this, he says, all of us leaning against our pickup trucks, we know that it's changing. He says it's just changing. We don't have the cold winters that we used to. We don't have near the precipitation that we used to. I mean, I know it was uphill both ways when I was a kid going to school, so, and 6 feet of snow. But it was, in that venue though, I was friends with Stan Clark from Ashton, and Stan showed me pictures of a snowmageddon here in Ashton, where the train was stuck out here on the tracks, couldn't go north or south because it was snowed in. The farmers had to come up with some fuel to even get the train going again once they plowed it out. I mean, things have changed, okay, and we're dealing with less water than there used to be. But what do? Do we put our head in the sand and say, the world's gonna crash tomorrow? No. Well, we're gonna do what we've always done, and we're gonna work through it, I think. And by how do we work through it? We have to adapt. We've got to become drought resilient. We got to learn how to do more, either the same with less or do less. I think that, we started out talking about water budget issues and how, Craig does a water budget. And I've got a full career here in hydrology, and I'm still looking at the water budget and going, I think I'm not sure I understand it completely. I don't. I think there's people say death by 1,000 paper cuts. I think that we got a lot of leaking things. We lose a lot. We've lost a lot of incidental recharge through what we saw as a micro, I call it a micro improvement in irrigation opportunities, but in the macro, we lost opportunity on that. So anyway, I'm passionate about what we can do. I think there's things that we can do before, we tell families they gotta move.
And this,
Actually, I'll just say, and then, that this is where I wanted to end up, so without the prompt, thank you for getting us to kind of where we've ended all of the seminars and each of the topics. I've wrapped up by asking everybody what they see in the future, your challenges and your opportunities, and you provided that right off. So let's see what James and Craig think about that.
So, as you guys have probably heard, the groundwater users and surface water users have found a settlement that gets them through this irrigation season. And they've agreed to set aside, they had, I think, 11 different places where they had litigation. Some cases in front of the Supreme Court, some at district court, some in front of the department. So they had 11 separate contested cases. They've decided to put that to the side for 3 months and try to find a long-term settlement. It's good news. The tone right now is not great between those two groups, and so I don't know whether they'll be able to find that settlement, but there has to be some change. There has to be some change from probably both groups. Surface water users need to maybe change some expectations, but the groundwater users need to change some practices too. And whether they can change enough that they can find an agreement long-term, I don't know. The other thing that we're doing right now is even kind of outside of the delivery call and that contested case in that fight, the department is putting together a groundwater management plan to stabilize and recover the aquifer. Because if you look at the aquifer trends for the last 50, 60 years, they've all been down. We've been losing water from the aquifer, as is shown. We can't continue that into perpetuity. So this management plan is meant to create an inflection point and start moving the other direction. That also is going to put some obligations on the groundwater users. We've been meeting for the last 9 months as we've created an advisory committee. We've been meeting for 9 months to discuss terms of what that plan could include. We haven't found a lot of consensus there either. What we have is a lot of disagreement at this point. That the hope is that over the next 3-6 months it will find some common ground.
Yeah, and when I look at this situation, it's a water budget problem. And so, what I ask myself is, are there any things that can be done to help the water budget? And, some of them are already being done. There's recharge. And so, the Water Resource Board has a program where they're building out recharge infrastructure. This past year we had, 600,000 acre feet spill past Milner Dam that was uncapturable. And if the infrastructure were in place to be able to capture that and throw it out somewhere where it's going to sink into the aquifer, then that's something that could help us, save the excess water in those years that we have it. And so I think recharge is an important component, and continuing to build out that recharge infrastructure is really important for these big water years. And then I think the other piece to that, and in my opinion, I think this might be the low-hanging fruit, is the cloud seeding program. So, the Idaho Power and the Water Resource Board do what is called cloud seeding. Essentially what that is they inject silver iodide into the clouds. It enhances the precipitation and you get more snow out of it. And, currently the program in the Upper Snake is generating 500,000 acre feet per year of additional water that they're just pulling out of the clouds. And, it looks like there's room to expand that program. They could add an additional airplane, they could put more generators into some spots in the mountains that they don't have them yet. And, I think that's a big question, how much more water could you add to the water budget from cloud seeding? And the price point of that is coming in very fair as well, where right now it's coming in under $4 per acre foot. And so I think big picture, trying to decide how you can fix the water budget is the only solution that keeps things in place as they are now. And in the meantime, kind of back to where James' point was, there needs to be some sort of agreement, some sort of settlement, some give and take from both sides to find a way to keep everyone in business.
Great. It's a little after 4. We've been running a little long on these because people are always interested and there's a lot of questions. So take a few questions if there are any. Got lots of them. So Lily and then Brandon.
This question could go for all of you, but so this is a very nuanced thing, water rights, and I'm just wondering. So, do most water users are they pretty apt in understanding? Do they understand a lot of the legislation behind it and what their water right means when they come to you with questions, or I don't know?
It's all over the board.
Yeah.
I think. With the water challenges that we've had, I would say that a lot of them have done the deep dive. They understand more. There's some really sharp groundwater users out there too. I've talked to some that I think know more than I do, to some degree on these issues, and I'm very impressed. And most of those are leading their boards. They're their lead person that helps them. They don't all understand it, to the degree that, and nobody, this is you said it very well, very nuanced, and it's good to get the people out front that do understand it to lead the charge, I think.
I agree. I think the average water user probably doesn't know very much, but the people that serve on boards and in leadership positions do.
Okay.
Brandon?
So, James, you mentioned change and settlements and everything that's kind of going on right now. This question could be for you or Craig or Roger, but as the Henry Sport Foundation, do you see a role for someone like us, and what do you think it might be if there is a role for us to help with this situation?
Well, I know, because I've attended some of the meetings, I know that you guys are having these same discussions, right? You're looking in the upper Teton and saying, wait, we're losing through efficiency projects, we're losing natural recharge. And that recharge, sure, it may come down and serve water rights in Rexburg, so ultimately it may be diverted, but it serves a benefit to the stream all the way between where it arises to Rexburg, right? And so there's real benefits to the stream by saving that water that's available early, getting it in the ground and having it come back later, even in that same water year. So I know you guys are kind of wrestling with some of these same questions on more of a basin-wide scale as we're dealing with the entire ESPA. And I think it's worth noting, man, the Water Resource Board does have money right now for these recharge projects. So if you've got a site that you know of, hey, we think we can put water in the ground here, if we can improve this head gate, it'll help us get water out during the early season when there's water available. I'd say approach the board right now with a proposal.
Yeah, I'd like to put an exponent on what he just said. I can't agree enough on that. What Christina's done on her studies on incidental recharge loss, I think I've been trying to get with Christina so we can shoehorn that study further south into the Snake Plain to understand that. I kind of fell into this by accident, 2015, and it continues to go. But there's a significant public concern with domestic wells and the domestic consumption, and so I partnered with Garth Taylor, who's an economist with University of Idaho, and we looked at this issue, and Garth, through his studies, just said, look, all of the DCMI, which is domestic, commercial, municipal, and industrial water rights, account for about 3% of all the groundwater. And so I took that value and I said, okay, so how much can we attribute to incidental recharge to the aquifer? And I think in my talk, I can't remember it specifically, but I think it was about 6% or greater that returned from incidental recharge. And my point in talking about that was, let's focus on something that can really move the needle. I know it's a domestic well is an issue, and everybody hates it when their neighborhood becomes a new subdivision. But is it really going to move the needle on the aquifer health? Mm-hmm. And I would say not by much. Okay, and so again, just what James said. I think that there are most of the low-hanging fruit on recharge has been done. But I would have to add that 2 years ago, when the lawyers challenged during the drought. We had a drought 2 years ago, and they called for the water again that they were getting, and the groundwater users had been throwing all this extra water in recharge, and they said, well, it's still coming out of the aquifer, and they said, well, no, you only get credit for the year that you recharge in, and we call that averaging, and I think, you know, the lawyers stuck their feet down real hard and said, you know, we're not going to accept averaging on that, and I feel that if they hadn't stuck their feet down on averaging, we would have had a lot more recharge in the last 2 years, and we would not be in the fight again right now. I don't think.
Interesting.
Because I think we're headed in the right direction, and I think the data bears out too that the aquifer was headed in the right direction, and you know, we knew drought's coming. We knew it was going to change, but and we know from the modeling, the same modeling the department uses, that there is a decay that will take over a year, and that water just doesn't run out, you know, of the aquifer in 1 year.
Any other questions? We can take one more if somebody has one. Jack?
I got one. I've been told that one way people abstract groundwater is to think about it as like another reservoir in the system. And that made a lot of sense to me when it was told to me, but I want to know from you all how that might be true and how that might not be true. Treating groundwater as if it was another American Falls reservoir or something like that.
There are places in the West where groundwater can act as a true reservoir. They're isolated basins. You put water in, you come back 10 years later, it's still there. It's not going anywhere. The SPA, as Roger pointed out, is very different because it's a leaky bathtub, right? You've got multiple places where a significant amount of water is leaving the aquifer continuously. So yeah, there are studies that are done with each of the recharge basins that are being considered that look at residence time, meaning if I put a drop of water in at this location, how long does it take before it shows up in the river again? And some of those residence times are within a year, right? I mean, within the same irrigation season, that water would come back into the stream. Some of them are multi-year, 10-year, right? I mean, and so it can act at times, it can act like a storage reservoir, but in some ways it doesn't.
But even those short times, I mean, and this is a great conversation we're having because, you know, some argued on that, those short times and said, well, this doesn't do any good. Well, it does, because when that water comes back is when we're storing water in the reservoirs again.
Or curtailing water rates.
Or curtailing water rates.
And it's
Yeah, I mean, it's just, even a short time is, it's not ideal. I mean, it's not a closed basin that we'd say, oh yeah, let's fill it up and we can, you know, we'll have it for the next, it's not like a freezer with a, you know, half a beef in it, but the decay is different and varies, but it still benefits everybody.
And I know the Water Resource Board is trying to get a mixture of sites, right? Some long retention sites and some short retention sites, and dedicating money to the whole spectrum of sites.
And it's more difficult to get water into it, right? So, you know, as opposed to just blocking a stream and impounding the water, to actually get water into the aquifer, you know, that may be layered in different ways, can be a lot more complicated.
But I'm saying a lot, and Christina knows I'll talk. Okay? But this is one I want you to hold on to. Put this one in your pocket. On average, there's 1 million acre feet that flow out of the system, okay, that we don't capture. But the problem with that is that 1 million acre feet comes in about 30 days. So you've got to build a big recharge pond, lake, to put that in. And we've got, you know, we've done a lot of small town stuff, gravel pits, everything. We've done most of those. Well, there's a few more. We're going to do more, okay? But the really big stuff, if we're going to make a dent in it, that's you got to be able to put away a lot of water in a very short duration.
Well, I think, what, yes. I think we'll quit there. I know the four of us could talk about water for like
We'll stay late. to answer
for
questions.
hours. But yeah, if you all can stick around, if some of you have some more questions, but yeah, that was just outstanding. I really appreciate the three of you being willing to come talk to us this afternoon. And so let's thank our guests. We do have a token of appreciation for you all.
I was